In the affluent suburbs of San Diego, California, a simple parking dispute was about to shatter one woman's perception of privilege and power. What began as another morning of entitlement for Andrea Richardson would end in a profound lesson about respect, service, and the true meaning of strength. Little did she know that her decision to dismiss a veteran's parking sign would lead to an encounter that would change her life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Southern California sun painted golden streaks across the polished hood of Andrea Richardson's Range Rover as she pulled into the parking lot of La Costa Village, San Diego's premier waterfront shopping district. The morning marine layer was just beginning to burn off, revealing a cloudless February sky that promised another perfect day in paradise. At 48, Andrea had mastered the art of making an entrance, and her choice of parking space was no exception. As the CEO of Coastal Elite Properties, Andrea had built her reputation on turning luxury real estate dreams into reality. Her name graced the top 100 most influential women in real estate list 3 years running, and her face regularly appeared on billboards throughout San Diego's most prestigious neighborhoods. The designer sunglasses perched on her perfectly highlighted hair, the Hermes bag casually slung over her shoulder, the Louboutin heels that clicked authoritatively against the pavement. These weren't just accessories, they were weapons in her arsenal of success. Before we dive deeper into what happened next, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from. If you've ever witnessed someone getting exactly what they deserved, you won't want to miss what's coming. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's conclusion will leave you speechless. Andrea's morning routine was a carefully choreographed performance of power and prestige. Every Tuesday began with a private Pilates session at her exclusive beach club, followed by a strategy meeting with her top agents at Sunrise Coffee House, the trendy oceanfront cafe where San Diego's power players gathered to discuss million-dollar deals over artisanal lattes and gluten-free pastries. Her latest triumph, securing the exclusive listing rights for the new luxury development in La Jolla, had set the real estate community buzzing. Her phone hadn't stopped chiming with congratulatory messages and partnership proposals since the news broke yesterday. Andrea allowed herself a satisfied smirk as she checked her appearance in the rearview mirror. Success, she had learned, was about projecting the right image at all times. The parking lot at La Costa Village was starting to fill with the usual morning crowd, young professionals in their modest vehicles, shop owners preparing for another day of catering to the wealthy, and fellow entrepreneurs in their luxury cars. Andrea's eyes landed on a prime spot directly in front of Sunrise Coffee House, marked with a sign she had seen countless times before, reserved for military veterans. Andrea had always found these designated spaces irritating. While she supported the troops in theory, she had even hosted a fundraiser for veterans last year, though mainly for the networking opportunities. She couldn't understand why they needed special treatment in civilian life. Besides, it was barely 8:15 a.m., and what veteran would be visiting an upscale coffee shop at this hour? With practiced precision, she guided her Range Rover into the spot, adjusting perfectly between the lines. The morning sun glinted off her car's custom metallic paint, a shade specifically created for her by the dealership's elite customization program. She gathered her leather portfolio and designer bag, preparing for the meeting that would cement her latest real estate empire expansion. Her team would be arriving soon, and she had several contracts to review before their discussion. The cafe's warm lighting beckoned through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and Andrea could already smell the aroma of premium coffee beans being freshly ground. She stepped out of her vehicle, her red-soled heels making contact with the pavement like an exclamation point to her arrival. The sound of waves crashing against the nearby shore provided a soothing backdrop to the morning bustle, reminding her why she had chosen San Diego as her base of operations. The city's perfect blend of military presence and affluent culture had created an ideal market for her luxury real estate ventures. The irony of dismissing a veteran's parking space while profiting from the military community's presence wasn't lost on her. She simply didn't care. What Andrea couldn't have known as she strode toward the cafe's entrance was that this ordinary Tuesday morning would become anything but ordinary. Her decision to dismiss a simple parking sign was about to bring her face to face with someone who would challenge everything she thought she knew about power, privilege, and respect. The perfectly orchestrated symphony of her life was about to encounter a discordant note that would resonate through every carefully constructed wall of her professional fortress. Have you ever witnessed someone's sense of entitlement lead to an unforgettable lesson? Drop a comment below and make sure you're subscribed, because you won't believe what happens next in this story of karma and redemption. Andrea's Louboutin heels echoed against the polished concrete as she made her way towards Sunrise Coffeehouse's entrance. Her platinum blonde hair caught the morning light, and her Rolex glinted as she checked the time. 8:20 a.m. Perfectly early, as always. Through the cafe's windows, she could see the staff arranging fresh pastries in the display case and preparing the specialty coffee equipment that would soon serve San Diego's elite their morning fuel. Drop a like if you've ever encountered someone who thinks rules don't apply to them, because what happens next will have you on the edge of your seat. The cafe's interior was a masterpiece of modern coastal design, something Andrea had actually consulted on during its renovation last year. Natural wood, brushed steel, and floor-to-ceiling windows created an atmosphere of casual luxury that perfectly matched the clientele. The owner had even incorporated her suggestion for a semi-private meeting area where real estate deals could be discussed away from the general public. As she reached for the door handle, movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. A man had appeared near her Range Rover, his stance suggesting purpose rather than casual observation. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, wearing simple dark jeans and a fitted black t-shirt that hinted at a physically demanding lifestyle. There was something about his bearing that seemed different from the usual La Costa Village crowd. A quiet intensity that made Andrea pause. Initially, she tried to ignore him, focusing instead on her upcoming meeting. Her team would be arriving soon to discuss the new La Jolla development project, and she had several contract points to review. But her attention kept drifting back to the window. The man hadn't moved. He was still studying her car and the veteran's parking sign with deliberate attention. His stillness was unsettling, so unlike the hurried energy of the business district. Andrea's first instinct was annoyance. She had important matters to attend to, and this distraction was unwelcome. She watched as he pulled out his phone, seemingly taking photos of her car and the parking sign. The action sparked a flutter of indignation in her chest. Who did he think he was, documenting her parking choice as if it were some kind of violation? She considered her options. Her team would be arriving in 10 minutes for their 8:30 meeting. The professional thing would be to stay focused on her preparation, to let this minor annoyance pass. But something about the man's demeanor, his calm, assured presence, needled at her carefully maintained composure. Before we continue with what happened next, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video will reveal a twist that nobody saw coming. Rising from her selected table, the best in the house naturally, Andrea straightened her Chanel blazer and walked purposefully toward the door. She had handled countless challenging situations in her career. This would be no different. The click of her heels on the hardwood floor echoed her determination as she pushed through the cafe's entrance into the mild February morning. The man looked up as she approached, his expression neutral but attentive. Up close, Andrea noticed more details: the military precision of his posture, the watchful awareness in his eyes, the way he seemed to assess her approach without apparent concern. His composure only served to fuel her irritation. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she used in board meetings. "That's my car you're photographing." She gestured toward her Range Rover, its custom paint gleaming in the morning sun. The man lowered his phone slowly, deliberately. His movements were economical, assured, carrying none of the nervous energy she was accustomed to seeing in people. Confronted by her authority, the morning breeze carried the salt scent from the nearby ocean, and seagulls called overhead, creating an oddly peaceful backdrop to the brewing confrontation. What Andrea couldn't have known as she stood there, radiating indignation, was that this seemingly simple exchange was about to evolve into something far more significant. The man before her wasn't just another critic of her parking choice. He was someone who would challenge everything she thought she knew about power, respect, and true strength. The gap between their perspectives seemed to widen with each passing moment. The man's quiet confidence was a stark contrast to Andrea's increasingly defensive posture. She was accustomed to wielding her influence like a shield, but this encounter felt different. Through the cafe windows, curious onlookers had begun to notice the exchange, adding an audience to what Andrea had assumed would be a quick dismissal of an irrelevant complaint. "Yes, ma'am, there is a problem," the man replied, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority. "You're parked in a space reserved for veterans." His tone was measured, neither aggressive nor apologetic, simply stating a fact that required attention. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting shorter shadows across the Costa Village parking lot. Andrea felt a flash of defensive anger rise in her chest. The day had started so perfectly, and now this stranger was lecturing her about parking spaces. Through the cafe windows, she could see her team beginning to arrive, their confused glances in her direction only fueling her irritation. "I'm well aware of the sign," she said, gesturing dismissively. "I'll only be here for an hour or so. There are plenty of other spots available." She emphasized the word plenty as if its abundance somehow justified her choice. A light breeze carried the sound of seagulls and distant boat horns from the marina, a peaceful counterpoint to the tension building between them. The man's expression remained unchanged, but something in his eyes hardened slightly. "That's not the point," he responded, his calm demeanor unaffected by her attempt at dismissal. "These spots are reserved out of respect for those who've served. It's not about convenience." His words, though polite, carried an underlying strength that Andrea found unsettling. She was used to people backing down when confronted with her authority, but this man seemed unmoved by her status or confidence. The morning crowd at Costa Village had begun to take notice of their exchange, some slowing their pace to observe the interaction. "Look," she said, trying to maintain control of the situation. "I understand you're concerned, but I have an important meeting starting soon. I'm sure any veterans who need the spot can park temporarily in one of the other available spaces." She glanced at her watch, 8:28 a.m. Her team was assembled inside, probably wondering what was delaying their usually punctual leader. The man's posture shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Your meeting's importance doesn't change the purpose of this space," he continued, his voice level but firm. "These spaces serve a purpose beyond mere convenience. They're a small recognition of sacrifice and service." Andrea felt her face flush. She was acutely aware of the growing audience, including several of her high-end clients who frequented the cafe at this hour. The thought of them witnessing this confrontation made her stomach tighten. "I respect the military," she said, her tone clipped. "I even hosted a veterans fundraiser last year, but surely you can see this is an overreaction. The lot is half empty." The man's expression shifted slightly, a mix of resignation and resolve crossing his features. "Hosting fundraisers is admirable," he acknowledged, "but respect isn't shown through occasional grand gestures. It's demonstrated in the small daily choices we make, especially when we think no one is watching." His words struck a nerve. Andrea remembered the fundraiser, how she'd used it to network with wealthy donors, how the veterans present had seemed almost like props in her carefully orchestrated evening of self-promotion. She pushed the uncomfortable thought aside, clinging to her position. "I have a business to run," she said, gesturing toward the cafe where her team waited. "My agents are arriving any minute for an important strategy meeting. Surely we can be practical about this." She emphasized the word practical as if it were a shield against his moral argument. "Practicality isn't the issue here," he replied, without hesitation. "It's about choosing to honor commitments made to those who serve. Every time someone disregards these spaces, they're saying their convenience matters more than that respect." Andrea felt increasingly off balance. The man's calm reasoning was harder to dismiss than angry accusations would have been. His presence commanded attention without demanding it, and she found her usual tactics of deflection and assertion failing. Through the cafe window, she could see her team exchanging glances, their confusion evident as they watched their usually confident leader engaged in this unexpected confrontation. "Who are you?" she finally asked, frustration evident in her voice. "Why do you care so much about one parking space?" Even as she asked, she knew she was making a mistake. The question implied his concern was excessive, but something in his bearing suggested she was the one who had misjudged the situation. The man met her gaze steadily. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Jack Torres, retired Navy SEAL. I served 15 years, including multiple combat deployments. These spaces may seem trivial to you, but they represent something important to those of us who've served." The revelation hit Andrea like a physical force. She had been arguing about respect and convenience with a Navy SEAL, someone who had dedicated his life to service while she focused on building her fortune. The magnitude of her misjudgment began to dawn on her, but pride kept her from backing down completely. The morning sun continued its climb, the shadows growing shorter, across the parking lot. But Andrea felt frozen in this moment of revelation. The carefully constructed world of privilege and power she had built for herself suddenly seemed to shift beneath her feet, as if the very ground she stood on was no longer as solid as she had always believed. Tell us in the comments if you've ever had a moment when you realized you were completely wrong about someone. The next part of this story will show exactly how this encounter changed Andrea's life forever. "Lieutenant Commander," Andrea began, attempting to regain some semblance of control, "I understand your position, but surely we can find a reasonable compromise. I have clients waiting, investments to discuss." Her voice carried a hint of desperation now, the usual authority wavering as she faced someone whose power came from a source she couldn't quite comprehend. Commander Torres shook his head slightly, not in anger, but with the patient certainty of someone who had faced far greater challenges than an executive's resistance. "Ms. Richardson, this isn't about finding a compromise. This is about doing what's right. The sign is clear, the purpose is clear, and the choice is yours to make." Daisy, a young couple, walked past them into the cafe, their conversation faltering as they sensed the tension in the air. Andrea felt exposed, her usual armor of professional confidence cracking under the weight of this unexpected confrontation. Through the cafe window, she could see her team shifting uncomfortably, watching their leader in an unfamiliar position of defensive uncertainty. "You have to understand," she pressed on, even as part of her recognized the futility of her position. "In business, everything is negotiable. There's always room for discussion, for finding mutual benefit. The words sounded hollow even as she spoke them, like lines from a script that no longer fit the scene. "This isn't a business deal," Commander Torres replied, his eyes holding her gaze steadily. "Some things in life aren't negotiable. Respect for service and sacrifice is one of them. The question is simple. Will you choose to honor that or not?" The simplicity of his question cut through her defenses like a knife through butter. In her world of complex real estate transactions and carefully worded contracts, she had forgotten that some things could be this straightforward: right or wrong, respect or disregard, honor or convenience. Her phone buzzed again, more insistently. This time, through the window, she could see her team's growing confusion and concern. The morning sun had risen higher, casting harsh light on her Range Rover, making the veteran parking sign impossible to ignore. 15 years of service, Commander Torres continued quietly. Multiple deployments, countless missions. My team and I gave everything we had to protect the freedoms you enjoy. The freedom to build your business, to pursue your success, to live in peace. That parking space isn't just about convenience. It's a small reminder of the cost of those freedoms. Andrea felt the first real crack in her resistance. The commander's words weren't just about a parking space anymore. They were about something much larger, something she had lost sight of in her pursuit of success and control. She thought about the veterans she had met at her fundraiser, how she had viewed them as networking opportunities rather than individuals who had sacrificed for her ability to build her real estate empire. The morning breeze carried the salt air from the harbor, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour. Andrea Richardson, who had built her reputation on never backing down, found herself facing a choice that would challenge everything. She thought she knew about power, respect, and true strength. Commander Torres maintained his steady presence, his military bearing evident in every aspect of his posture. His reference to multiple deployments and missions hung in the air, making a temporary parking convenience seem increasingly trivial against the backdrop of his service. "I've lost brothers in combat," he continued, his voice carrying a depth of experience that no business success could match. "Men and women who gave everything for this country. When we designate spaces like these, it's not just about parking. It's about remembering their sacrifice, about showing that their service mattered." Andrea glanced again at her watch, but the gesture felt empty now. Time, which she had always viewed as a resource to be managed and controlled, suddenly seemed less important than the lesson unfolding before her. A group of Marines in uniform walked past, their crisp appearance and respectful nods, to Commander Torres, serving as a reminder that San Diego wasn't just a luxury real estate market. It was a military town with a proud heritage. Their presence made Andrea's position feel even more uncomfortable. Her carefully constructed world of privilege and power was being dismantled not by force or anger, but by the quiet strength of a man who had earned his authority through sacrifice, rather than acquisition. The breeze picked up slightly, carrying the sound of the American flag flapping from the pole in front of the cafe, a sound she had never really noticed before. Now it seemed to punctuate every word Commander Torres spoke, a constant reminder of the principles she had chosen to ignore for her own convenience. "Tell us if you've ever had a moment when someone's words made you completely rethink your perspective on life. Stay tuned for tomorrow's part, where Andrea faces a decision that will change everything." "Commander," Andrea started again, her voice losing its earlier defensive edge, "I've always considered myself a patriotic person. I donate to veterans' charities, I attend Memorial Day services." She trailed off as she saw his expression, realizing how hollow these justifications sounded in the face of his actual service. He listened patiently, but his expression made it clear that financial contributions, while appreciated, weren't a substitute for basic respect. The morning light caught the silver at his temples, evidence of years spent in service to his country. "Sometimes," he said, his words measured and thoughtful, "the smallest actions reveal the most about our character. It's not about the grand gestures or public donations. It's about the choices we make when we think no one is watching." The truth of his observation struck home. In all her years of building her real estate empire, Andrea had focused on the big moves, the visible successes. But here was a man who understood that true character was revealed in the small moments, the seemingly insignificant choices that ultimately defined who you were as a person. Through the cafe window, she could see her team beginning to disperse, presumably to reschedule the meeting. The perfectly planned morning had derailed, but somehow, standing in that parking lot, facing a man who had risked everything for his country, the disruption to her schedule seemed increasingly meaningless. "In SEAL training," Commander Torres continued, his voice taking on a teaching tone, "they break you down to build you back up. But what they're really testing isn't physical strength, it's character. They want to see who you are when everything is stripped away, when there's no audience, no recognition, just you and your choices." A group of joggers passed by, their casual morning routine a stark contrast to the intensity of the moment unfolding in the parking lot. Andrea noticed how they instinctively gave Commander Torres a wider berth, as if sensing the gravity he carried. "When you're in combat," he continued, his eyes distant for a moment, "you learn quickly that your rank, your background, your personal achievements, none of that matters as much as your character, the way you handle yourself when things get difficult. That's what defines you." Andrea's hand tightened around her car keys. She thought about her morning schedule, now completely disrupted, but the importance of those meetings had diminished in the face of this unexpected lesson. "I've always prided myself on being in control," she admitted, surprising herself with the candor, on having the right answer, the perfect solution. "Control is an illusion," Torres replied, his blue eyes reflecting years of hard-earned wisdom. "In the field you learn that quickly. You can plan everything perfectly, but life has a way of teaching us humility. The true test isn't in never making mistakes, it's in how we respond when we realize we're wrong." The morning sun had risen higher, casting both their shadows long across the parking lot. Andrea could feel the warmth on her face, a physical reminder of how much time had passed since this encounter began. Her phone had stopped buzzing. The outside world seemed to have receded, leaving only this moment of truth. "I lead training exercises sometimes," Torres continued, "teaching new recruits about leadership and character. You know what I've noticed? The ones who struggle most aren't usually the ones who lack ability. They're the ones who can't admit when they're wrong, who can't set aside their ego for something bigger than themselves." His words struck home with uncomfortable accuracy. How many times had Andrea pushed ahead with her own agenda, dismissing the perspectives and needs of others? How often had she used her position and influence to avoid acknowledging her mistakes? "The parking space," she began, then paused, gathering her thoughts. "I saw it as just a convenience, something I could use because I was in a hurry. I never stopped to think about what it represented." "That's often how it starts," Torres nodded. "Small choices that seem insignificant at the time. But character isn't built or broken in the big moments. It's shaped by the small decisions we make when we think no one is watching." A seagull landed nearby, pecking at something on the pavement, its simple presence a reminder of how ordinary this morning had seemed just an hour ago. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. The carefully constructed walls of Andrea's worldview were crumbling, forced down by the weight of truths she had long chosen to ignore. Share in the comments if you've ever had someone's words make you question everything you thought you knew about success and respect. Tomorrow's part will reveal how this encounter changes Andrea's entire perspective on life. The men and women I served with, Commander Torres said, his voice taking on a deeper resonance. They didn't ask for recognition. They didn't serve for the praise or the parking spaces, but these small gestures of respect, they matter. They remind us that sacrifice has value, that service means something in a world that often seems to have forgotten. Andrea felt the full weight of her actions settling on her shoulders. She had approached this morning like any other, seeing the world through the lens of her own convenience and success. But standing here, facing a man who had given years of his life in service to others, that perspective seemed not just wrong, but shamefully inadequate. A young veteran walked past, his prosthetic leg visible beneath his shorts. Commander Torres nodded to him, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that spoke volumes about shared experiences and mutual respect. Andrea watched the exchange, suddenly aware of how many such moments she must have missed in her rush to maintain her image of success. "You know," Torres continued, his voice softening slightly, "in the teams we had a saying, the only easy day was yesterday. Most people think it's about physical challenges, but it's really about facing hard truths about ourselves, about making the right choices even when they're uncomfortable." The morning had grown warmer, but Andrea felt a chill run through her. How many times had she chosen personal comfort over principle? How often had she justified small ethical compromises in the name of efficiency or convenience? "I had a friend," Commander Torres said, his eyes taking on a distant look. "Marcus Sullivan. We went through Bud S together, served in the same team. He never made it home from his last deployment, leaving behind a wife and 3 young daughters." He paused, letting the reality of that sacrifice sink in. "When I see these parking spaces, I think of him, of all the Marcus Sullivans who never came home." The personal story hit Andrea like a physical force. She had never considered that these parking spaces might be connected to real people, to actual sacrifices made by individuals with names and families and dreams. The spaces she had so casually dismissed were more than mere conveniences. They were daily memorials to those who had given everything. Through the cafe window, she could see her team had completely dispersed. Her morning meeting, so crucial just an hour ago, seemed trivial now. The sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across the parking lot, but Andrea felt as if she was standing in the shadow of something much larger than herself. "In combat," Torres continued, his steady gaze meeting hers, "you learn quickly that the things society values, wealth, status, power, mean nothing when the bullets start flying. What matters is character, integrity, the willingness to put something larger than yourself first." Andrea looked at her Range Rover again, its luxury and expense suddenly seeming like poor substitutes for the values she had forgotten. The morning breeze carried the sound of the flags snapping in the wind, each crack like a reminder of the principles she had dismissed. "You mentioned earlier that everything is negotiable in business," Torres said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But some things shouldn't be. Respect, honor, sacrifice, these aren't bargaining chips. They're foundations that either support or undermine everything else we build." A group of naval officers walked past, their crisp uniforms and discipline bearing a visible reminder of the military community Andrea had thoughtlessly disregarded. Their presence made the veteran parking sign seem to stand out even more starkly against the morning sky. "When we designate these spaces," Torres explained, gesturing to the sign, "we're not just providing convenient parking, we're creating daily reminders of sacrifice, service, and the cost of freedom. Every time someone chooses to ignore that designation, they're not just taking a convenient spot, they're choosing to overlook the sacrifice that spot represents." Andrea felt something shift inside her, a subtle but fundamental change in her perspective. the practiced confidence that had carried her through countless business negotiations seemed to evaporate in the face of Commander Torres's quiet strength. The parking lot of Sunrise Coffee House had become an unexpected crossroads in her life, a moment of truth she hadn't seen coming. Tell us in the comments if you've ever had a moment that completely changed how you see the world. Tomorrow's part will show how this encounter transforms Andrea's entire approach to life and success. "I should move my car," Andrea said finally, the words coming out softer than her usual commanding tone. But even as she reached for her keys, she knew this wasn't just about relocating a vehicle. It was about acknowledging a deeper truth she had long ignored. Commander Torres nodded slightly, but made no move to leave. His presence remained steady, as if he sensed this moment was about more than just correcting a parking violation. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting clearer light on both of them, as if nature itself was determined to illuminate this moment of truth. "You know," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "in the SEALs, we learn that the hardest battles aren't always the physical ones. Sometimes the toughest fights are with ourselves, our pride, our assumptions, our need to maintain control." A group of Marine Corps officers walked past, their crisp uniforms and respectful nods to Commander Torres, serving as a visible reminder of the military community Andrea had thoughtlessly dismissed. Their presence made the veteran parking sign seem to stand out even more starkly against the morning sky. "When you're in combat," Torres continued, "you learn quickly that your rank, your background, your personal achievements, none of that matters as much as your character. The way you handle yourself when things get difficult, that's what defines you." Andrea's hand tightened around her car keys. She thought about her morning schedule, now completely disrupted, but the importance of those meetings had diminished. In the face of this unexpected lesson, her phone had been silent for several minutes now, as if the universe was giving her space to absorb this moment fully. "I've always prided myself on being in control," she admitted, surprising herself with the candor, "on having the right answer, the perfect solution, controlling every situation. But this morning—" She trailed off, realizing how her carefully constructed world was shifting beneath her feet. "Control is an illusion," Torres replied, his blue eyes reflecting years of hard-earned wisdom. "In the field, you learn that quickly. You can plan everything perfectly, but life has a way of teaching us humility. The true test isn't in never making mistakes. It's in how we respond when we realize we're wrong." Through the cafe window, Andrea could see her usual table now occupied by other patrons. Her morning routine had been completely disrupted, but somehow that disruption felt like a gift, a chance to step off the treadmill of success she'd been running on for so long. "I lead training exercises sometimes," Torres continued, "teaching new recruits about leadership and character. You know what I've noticed? The ones who struggle most aren't usually the ones who lack ability. They're the ones who can't admit when they're wrong, who can't set aside their ego for something bigger than themselves." A seagull landed nearby, pecking at something on the pavement. Its simple presence was a reminder of how ordinary this morning had seemed just an hour ago. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. The carefully constructed walls of Andrea's worldview were crumbling, forced down by the weight of truths she had long chosen to ignore. "The men and women I served with," Harrison said, his voice taking on a deeper resonance, "they didn't serve for recognition or special treatment. They served because they believed in something bigger than themselves. These parking spaces, they're not just about convenience. They're daily reminders that freedom isn't free, that the comfortable lives we lead were bought at a price." Andrea thought about her own comfortable life, the luxury SUV, the corner office, the multi-million-dollar listings. How many sacrifices by others had made those privileges possible? How many men and women like Commander Torres had put their lives on the line so she could build her empire? "You mentioned earlier about hosting fundraisers," Torres said, his gaze steady. "That's commendable, but true respect isn't shown through occasional grand gestures. It's demonstrated in the small daily choices we make, especially when we think no one is watching." Tell us in the comments if you've ever had a moment when someone's words made you completely rethink your priorities in life. Tomorrow's part will reveal how this encounter reshapes everything Andrea thought she knew about success. The morning crowd at Sunrise Coffee House had grown, with more people lingering near the windows to watch the exchange between Andrea and Commander Torres. She could feel their eyes on her, but for once their attention didn't bring the usual satisfaction. Instead, she felt exposed, as if her carefully crafted public image was being stripped away layer by layer. "You know what we tell our teams?" Torres asked, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby without seeming intentionally public. "Every mission, every decision, every moment of service, it all adds up to something bigger than ourselves. That's what these spaces represent, not just convenience, but a daily reminder of the cost of freedom." A young barista had stepped outside to clean the outdoor tables, but his movements were slow, deliberate, clearly intended to catch every word of the exchange. Andrea noticed how he kept glancing at Commander Torres with unmistakable respect, while carefully avoiding her own gaze. "In the teams," Torres continued, "we have another saying: check your ego at the door. It means understanding that no individual, no matter how successful or important they think they are, is bigger than the mission, bigger than the principles we serve." The morning breeze carried the scent of coffee and ocean air, along with fragments of conversation from onlookers. Andrea could hear whispers, could feel the judgment in their tones. She had always cultivated public attention, but this was different. This was seeing her at her worst, not her carefully presented best. "When I first joined the SEALs," Torres said, gesturing to the parking space that had sparked this confrontation, "I thought the hardest part would be the physical challenges. But over time I learned that the real challenges are moral ones. The daily choices that test our character, that show what we truly value." A couple of Andrea's regular clients walked past, people she had helped find multi-million-dollar properties. She saw recognition in their eyes, followed by something she wasn't used to seeing directed at her: disappointment. The realization stung more than she expected. "The thing about respect," Torres continued, his voice steady, "is that it's not something you can fake. It's not about grand gestures or public donations. It's about the small choices we make when we think no one's watching. Although right now," he added with a slight gesture to their growing audience, "people are definitely watching." Andrea felt her face flush. The public nature of this lesson in humility was perhaps the hardest part. She had built her career on being seen as powerful, successful, someone who made things happen. Now she was being seen as something entirely different, someone who had mistaken privilege for right. "You know what's remarkable about the SEAL teams?" Torres asked, seeming unbothered by their audience. "It's not the individual achievements. It's how a group of strong personalities learn to put aside their egos for something bigger than themselves. That's real strength." Through the cafe windows, Andrea could see phones being raised, people recording the encounter. In an age of social media, she knew this moment could quickly become public in ways she couldn't control. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who had always carefully managed her public image, was now the subject of a very different kind of attention. "Leadership in combat," Torres continued, his voice taking on a teaching tone, "teaches you that true influence isn't about imposing your will on others. It's about inspiring them to be their best selves, about showing through your actions what real strength looks like." A group of veterans who had been having coffee inside had moved to the window, watching the exchange with intense interest. Their presence added another layer of significance to the moment. These weren't just abstract principles being discussed, but lived experiences being either honored or dismissed. The hardest lesson for many SEAL candidates, Torres said, isn't the physical challenges. It's learning that true strength often means being willing to be vulnerable, to admit when you're wrong, to put the team's needs before your own ego. The harbor breeze had picked up, carrying the sound of boat horns from the marina. Andrea found herself thinking about how many service members had passed through this port, each carrying their own store of sacrifice and duty. How many times had she passed them without a second thought, focused only on her next deal or client meeting? Tell us in the comments if you've ever witnessed a public moment that changed someone's perspective forever. Tomorrow's part will reveal how this very public lesson transforms not just Andrea, but everyone watching. In 15 years of service, Commander Torres began, his voice taking on a deeper resonance, I've learned that the hardest battles aren't always the ones you can see. Sometimes they're the ones we fight within ourselves, between who we are and who we know we should be. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting clear light across the parking lot. Andrea noticed for the first time the faint scar running along Torres's jawline, a subtle reminder of the physical costs of his service. His steady presence carried a weight she was only beginning to understand, and his eyes held stories that no luxury or success could match. We lost 4 men during my last deployment, he continued, his eyes distant with memory. Each of them left behind families, dreams, futures they'd planned. Mike Sullivan had 3 kids and a wife who taught elementary school. Dave Chen was engaged to be married. Tom Rodriguez had just started his own business. Jake Miller's daughter was born. While he was deployed, he never got to hold her. The commander's voice remained steady, but Andrea could hear the emotion beneath his controlled tone. Each name he spoke seemed to hang in the air, making the parking space dispute feel increasingly trivial against the weight of these lost lives. Every time I see someone casually dismiss a space reserved for veterans, he went on, I think about those men, about the price they paid for the freedoms we all enjoy. I think about their families, who still carry the weight of their sacrifice, every single day. A veteran who had been watching from the cafe doorway stepped forward, his own military bearing evident as he nodded to Commander Torres. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, he said by way of introduction. 2 tours in Afghanistan. The silent understanding that passed between the 2 men made Andrea feel like an outsider witnessing something sacred. The Marine veteran, who introduced himself as Sergeant James Martinez, added his own perspective. I lost my best friend in Kandahar, he said, his voice carrying the same quiet strength as Torres's. When people ask me why these small gestures of respect matter, I think about him, about how he gave everything so others could live their lives in peace and prosperity. You see, Torres continued, addressing both Andrea and their growing audience, these spaces aren't just about convenience. They're small monuments to sacrifice, daily reminders that the comfortable lives we lead were bought at a price. When someone chooses to ignore these designations, they're not just taking a parking spot, they're dismissing the sacrifices of countless men and women. The veteran from the doorway added quietly, we don't ask for much, just respect for what we've given, for what our brothers and sisters have given. His words carried no anger, just a quiet dignity that made them even more powerful. In SEAL training, Torres continued, they put you through what's called Hell Week, 5.5 days of constant physical challenges, minimal sleep and cold water exposure. But you know what breaks most candidates. It's not the physical pain. It's failing to understand that it's not about individual survival. It's about serving something greater than yourself. He paused, looking at the growing crowd of onlookers. That lesson stays with you long after you leave the service. You learn that true strength isn't about personal achievement or success, it's about your contribution to something larger than yourself. Andrea listened, acutely aware of how her designer heels and luxury SUV suddenly seemed like hollow symbols of success. The commander's words were painting a picture of a different kind of achievement, one measured not in dollars or status, but in service and sacrifice. "I remember my first combat mission," Torres said, his voice measured and clear. "We weren't thinking about recognition or special parking spaces. We were thinking about protecting each other, about serving our country, about getting everyone home alive. That kind of experience changes how you see the world." The morning crowd had grown quieter, drawn in by the commander's words. Even the usual cafe noise seemed muted, as if the space itself was paying respect to the weight of his experiences. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking in a stage whisper if the commander was a real hero. The question hung in the air, making Andrea increasingly uncomfortable with her earlier attitude. "You know what stays with you?" he continued, looking directly at Andrea. "It's not the medals or the ceremonies. It's the faces of the men and women you served with, the ones who made it home and the ones who didn't. Every veteran's parking space represents thousands of those faces, thousands of those stories." The breeze carried the sound of the flag snapping in the wind, each crack seeming to punctuate his words. Andrea found herself looking at that flag, differently now, seeing it not just as decoration, but as a symbol of the sacrifices he described. "When we designate these spaces," Torres explained, gesturing to the sign she had so casually ignored, "we're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for a small acknowledgement of the price that's been paid for the freedoms we all enjoy. Every time someone chooses to respect these spaces, they're saying those sacrifices matter." Share your thoughts in the comments if you've ever heard a veteran story that changed your perspective on life. Tomorrow's part will reveal how Commander Torres's experiences lead to an even deeper revelation about the true meaning of respect and sacrifice. Commander Torres's words about sacrifice hung in the air as another group of service members approached from the cafe. They were young sailors, probably stationed at the nearby naval base, and their presence added another layer of significance to the unfolding scene. Andrea watched as they automatically straightened their posture upon recognizing Torres, their ingrained respect visible in every movement. "You know what we teach our new operators?" Torres continued, his voice carrying across the now quiet parking lot. "We teach them that the uniform isn't what makes you a warrior. It's your character, your willingness to put others before yourself, your understanding that some principles aren't negotiable." The morning had grown warmer, but Andrea felt a chill run through her as his words struck home. She thought about her own principles, or rather the lack of them. How many times had she justified putting her convenience first? How often had she dismissed the needs of others in pursuit of her own success? "In the teams," Torres said, gesturing to the young sailors who had stopped to listen, "we have a saying: the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in combat. But it's not just about physical preparation. It's about building the kind of character that makes the right choices automatically, even when those choices are difficult." A woman in the growing crowd stepped forward, tears visible in her eyes. "My son," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He's serving in Afghanistan right now. When I see people ignore these parking spaces, it feels like they're ignoring his sacrifice too." Her words added another dimension to the moment, reminding everyone that service affects not just veterans, but entire families. Commander Torres nodded in acknowledgement of her statement. "That's exactly it," he said. "These spaces represent more than just convenient parking. They're a daily reminder of the ongoing sacrifices being made by service members and their families. When someone chooses to ignore these designations, they're not just being inconsiderate, they're dismissing the very real cost of their freedoms. Andrea's phone buzzed again in her pocket, probably another message about her delayed meeting, but she couldn't bring herself to check it. The artificial urgency of her business dealings seemed increasingly hollow against the weight of real sacrifice being discussed. "Let me tell you about my first mission as a team leader," Torres continued, his eyes taking on a distant look. "We were tasked with extracting a high-value target from hostile territory. Everything went according to plan until it didn't. One of my men took a bullet protecting another team member. As I held him, trying to stop the bleeding, he wasn't thinking about himself. His only concern was whether the mission was accomplished, whether his teammates were safe." The crowd had grown completely silent, hanging on every word. Even the usual sounds of the cafe and parking lot seemed muted, as if nature itself was paying respect to these stories of sacrifice. "That man survived," Torres said, his voice carrying both pride and pain. "But he lost his leg. Today, he works, helping other wounded veterans adjust to civilian life. And you know what? Sometimes he can't find parking close enough to the VA hospital because people who haven't sacrificed anything think their convenience matters more than his service." The young sailors had moved closer, forming a loose semicircle around Torres. And Andrea. Their presence created an unspoken barrier, not threatening but definitive, as if they were containing this moment until its lesson was fully delivered. "In combat," Torres continued, "you learn quickly that every decision has consequences. Each choice you make affects not just you, but everyone around you. When you choose to ignore a sign reserving space for veterans, you're making a statement about what you value and what you don't." A gentle breeze carried the sound of morning colors from the nearby base, the distant notes of the national anthem adding an almost surreal backdrop to the moment. Andrea watched as every service member present, including Torres, turned slightly toward the sound and stood a bit straighter. "You see that response?" Torres asked, after the last note faded. "That automatic show of respect, it's not about tradition or rules. It's about understanding that some things are bigger than personal convenience, bigger than individual desires. It's about recognizing that we're part of something larger than ourselves." The mother of the deployed soldier wiped her eyes quietly. "My son writes to me about the things he sees," she shared, her voice stronger now. "About the cost of freedom. He never complains, never asks for recognition. All he wants is for people back home to understand and respect what service means." Tell us in the comments if you've ever witnessed a moment that made you completely rethink your priorities in life. Tomorrow's part will reveal how this confrontation transforms not just Andrea, but everyone watching. A gust of wind carried the scent of ocean air across the parking lot, and with it came a memory that Andrea had long suppressed. "My father," she said, her voice softer than before, "he served in Vietnam, 3rd Marine Division. He never talked about it much." Commander Torres's expression shifted slightly, showing the first hint of something beyond his professional demeanor. "They rarely do," he replied gently. "That generation of veterans came home to a different America. Many of them carried their experiences in silence, but that doesn't make their sacrifice any less significant." Andrea felt something crack inside her carefully maintained facade. "The only time I ever saw him cry," she continued, surprising herself with this sudden vulnerability, was at his best friend's funeral. Another Marine. Dad wouldn't talk about how he died, just said that some debts can never be repaid. The morning crowd had grown quieter, sensing the shift in the conversation's tone. The mother of the deployed soldier stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Andrea's arm in silent understanding. "Your father's generation," Torres said, his voice carrying deep respect. They faced challenges that went beyond the battlefield. They served with honor, came home to controversy, and still maintained their dignity. Many of them chose silence as a way of protecting their families from the weight of what they'd experienced. An older man in the crowd, wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap, nodded slowly. "We didn't want our kids to know," he said, his voice rough, with emotion. "Didn't want them to carry our burdens. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe if we talked more, people would understand better why these small gestures of respect matter so much." Andrea thought about her father's quiet pride, how he'd never used his veteran status for advantage or recognition. She'd always interpreted his silence as discomfort with his service, but now she wondered if she'd misunderstood his dignity for shame. "You know," Torres continued, "in the teams, we talk about different kinds of courage. There's the courage it takes to run toward danger. Yes. But there's also the courage it takes to live with the memories, to carry the weight of experience with grace, to choose respect over recognition." The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across the parking lot. Andrea noticed how it glinted off her father's old dog tags, which she'd kept in her car's glove compartment for years without really understanding why. "When I was growing up," she admitted, "I used to find it frustrating how Dad would always park at the back of lots, leaving the closer spaces for others, even when it was raining, even when there were plenty of spots available. He said it was just habit, but now I wonder." "Your father understood something profound," Torres replied, "something that many veterans learn through service, that true strength often shows itself in small acts of consideration, in choosing to put others first, even when no one's watching." The Vietnam veteran in the crowd spoke up again. "We see our brothers and sisters in these spaces," he said, gesturing to the sign Andrea had ignored. "Not just the ones who made it home, but the ones who didn't. Every time someone shows respect for these designations, they're showing respect for all of us, for all our sacrifices." Andrea thought about the fundraiser she'd hosted, how she'd used her father's service as a talking point without ever really honoring its meaning. The realization brought a flush of shame to her cheeks. "Commander," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I've been thinking about my father's service all wrong, haven't I? Using it as a shield to justify my actions instead of understanding what it really meant." Torres nodded slowly. "It's never too late to understand," he said. "Your father's service, like all service, was about putting something larger than himself first. These parking spaces, they're not just about convenience. They're about acknowledging that spirit of sacrifice, about showing that we as a society remember and honor those who served." The mother of the deployed soldier squeezed Andrea's arm gently. "My son writes to me about the bonds they form," she said softly, "how they learn to see beyond themselves, to understand that some things are worth sacrificing for. Maybe that's what your father was trying to teach you, in his own quiet way. Tell us in the comments if you've ever discovered a deeper meaning behind a parent's actions years later." Tomorrow's part will reveal how this understanding of her father's service changes everything for Andrea. The weight of revelation pressed against Andrea's chest as memories of her father flooded back. She remembered finding his medals in the attic when she was young, how he'd quietly put them away when she asked about them. At the time, she'd thought he was embarrassed. Now she understood he had been protecting her from truths she wasn't ready to understand. "You know," Commander Torres said, noticing her internal struggle, "in the SEALs, we have a saying, 'The only easy day was yesterday.' Most people think it's about physical challenges, but it's really about facing hard truths about ourselves, about having the courage to challenge our own assumptions." The morning sun had grown warmer, but Andrea felt a chill run through her. as she remembered her father's final days, how even in the hospital he'd insisted on giving up his private room to another veteran who needed it more. She'd been frustrated by what she saw as his unnecessary sacrifice, but now that memory took on a different meaning. "My father," she began, her voice wavering slightly. Even at the end, he never talked about himself. When visitors would thank him for his service, he'd just shake his head and say there were others who gave more. She paused, fighting back. Unexpected tears. "I always thought he was being modest, but he wasn't, was he? He was remembering." The Vietnam veteran in the crowd nodded solemnly. "We all remember," he said. "Every day, we remember the ones who didn't come home, the ones who gave everything. That's why these small gestures of respect mean so much. They tell us that others remember too." Commander Torres's expression softened slightly. "Your father understood something profound," he said. "Something that many veterans learn through service. That true honor isn't found in recognition or special treatment. It's found in how we carry the memory of those who sacrificed everything." The mother of the deployed soldier wiped her eyes quietly. "My son writes the same way in his letters," she shared, "always deflecting praise, always talking about his fellow soldiers instead of himself. It's like they're all part of something bigger than any individual." Andrea thought about her own life, how she'd pursued success with singular focus, measuring everything in terms of personal gain. The contrast with her father's quiet dignity made her chest tight with shame. "I've been so wrong," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, I thought success was about power, about making the world bend to your will. But my father—" She gestured helplessly at the veteran's parking space she had so casually claimed. "He knew what real strength looked like, didn't he?" "True strength," Torres replied gently, "often looks different than we expect. It's not always about asserting power or claiming privilege. Sometimes it's about choosing to put others first, even in small ways, even when no one's watching." The morning crowd had grown completely silent, witnessing this moment of transformation. Through the cafe windows, Andrea could see her team watching, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. Her carefully constructed world of power and privilege seemed to be crumbling around her. "When we're in combat," Torres continued, "we learn quickly that the things society values, wealth, status, power, mean nothing when the bullets start flying. What matters is character, integrity, the willingness to put something larger than yourself first." A young sailor in the crowd spoke up, his voice carrying both respect and emotion. "That's what these spaces represent, ma'am," he said. "Not just convenience, but a daily reminder that some people choose to put service before self, that some sacrifices deserve to be remembered." Andrea felt tears threatening to spill over. She thought about all the times she'd dismissed such gestures as unnecessary, how she'd used her father's service as a shield while completely missing its meaning. "Commander," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I've spent years building what I thought was success, but standing here now, thinking about my father, about all the veterans who've served, I realize I've completely misunderstood what true success looks like." The breeze carried the distant sound of a bugle from the naval base, the notes hanging in the air like a soundtrack to this moment of truth. Andrea watched as every service member present instinctively straightened, their ingrained respect a stark contrast to her earlier casual dismissal of military honors. Tell us in the comments if you've ever had a moment when everything you thought you knew about success and strength was turned upside down. Tomorrow's part will show how this profound realization changes Andrea's entire approach to life. Commander Torres watched as Andrea wiped away an unexpected tear, her carefully applied makeup smudging slightly. The morning sun caught the moisture in her eyes, making them shine with a vulnerability that had been absent just an hour ago. You know what we teach in advanced training? Torres said, his voice gentle but firm. We teach that the hardest person to lead is yourself. The toughest battles aren't always external. Sometimes they're the ones we fight within ourselves, between who we are and who we know we should be. A cool breeze swept through the parking lot, carrying with it the distant sound of ships' horns. From the harbour, Andrea found herself thinking about her father again, about all the subtle lessons she'd missed in her rush to build her empire. In the teams, Torres continued, we have a concept called earned wisdom. It's the understanding that some lessons can't be taught, they have to be experienced. Sometimes those experiences come at a high cost, and sometimes they come in unexpected moments, like this one. The growing crowd had formed a respectful semicircle around them. Among them, the Vietnam veteran who had spoken earlier nodded slowly. It's like ripples in a pond, he added. Our actions affect more than just ourselves. Every time someone chooses to respect these spaces, they're creating ripples of understanding, of acknowledgement. Andrea looked at her Range Rover, still, parked in the veteran's spot. What had seemed like a simple matter of convenience now felt like a symbol of everything she needed to change. "Commander," she said, her voice steadier now, "I keep thinking about something my father used to say. He would tell me that success isn't about what you gain, but about what you give. I thought I understood what he meant, but I didn't, did I?" Torres smiled slightly, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Your father sounds like he understood something fundamental about service. It's not about what you get, it's about what you give. Every veteran who comes home carries that lesson with them, though we express it in different ways." The mother of the deployed soldier stepped forward again. "My son wrote something similar in his last letter," she shared. "He said that over there, they don't measure people by their rank or their background. They measure them by their willingness to put others first." A young Marine who had joined the gathering spoke up. "That's what these parking spaces represent, Mom," he said respectfully. "Not privilege, but recognition of sacrifice. Every time someone honors these spaces, they're saying those sacrifices matter." Andrea thought about her morning schedule, now completely disrupted. Her team had long since dispersed, her meetings cancelled or rescheduled. Yet somehow none of that seemed to matter anymore. The priorities that had seemed so crucial just hours ago now felt hollow and insignificant. "When we designate spaces like these," Torres explained, gesturing to the sign she had ignored, "we're not just providing convenient parking. We're creating daily reminders that freedom isn't free, that the comfortable lives we enjoy came at a price. Every time someone chooses to respect these spaces, they're acknowledging that price." The morning had grown warmer, but Andrea felt a different kind of warmth spreading through her chest, the warmth of understanding, of seeing truth that had been there all along. "I've been measuring success all wrong," she admitted, her voice carrying a new note of clarity. "I've been counting dollars and deals, square footage and sale prices. But real value, real success, it's about something else entirely, isn't it?" Commander Torres nodded slowly. "In the SEALs, we have a saying, the only easy day was yesterday. It means that growth never stops, that each day brings new challenges, new opportunities to prove who we are and what we stand for. The question is, what will we do with those opportunities?" Tell us in the comments if you've ever had a moment that completely changed how you measure success in life. Tomorrow's part will reveal how Andrea's new understanding transforms not just her actions, but her entire approach to life. Andrea's fingers tightened around her car keys as she made a decision that felt both small and monumental. "I need to move my car," she said, her voice carrying a new kind of strength, not the artificial authority she'd cultivated over years in real estate, but something more genuine. Commander Torres nodded, but made no move to hurry her. He understood that this wasn't just about relocating a vehicle. It was about acknowledging a fundamental shift in perspective. "In the teams," he said, watching as she took a step toward her Range Rover, "we learn that true change isn't about grand gestures. It's about the small decisions we make when facing our mistakes, about choosing to do what's right even when it's inconvenient." The morning crowd parted slightly to let Andrea pass, but no one left. They seemed to sense that this moment was about more than just correcting a parking violation. The Vietnam veteran who had spoken earlier caught her eye and gave her an encouraging nod. "You know," the veteran said, his voice carrying decades of wisdom, "it takes more courage to admit a mistake and correct it than to stubbornly defend it. That's something we learned the hard way in my generation." As Andrea reached her car, she noticed something she hadn't before. A small memorial sticker in the window of the vehicle parked next to her space. It showed a soldier's silhouette and the words, "In memory of PFC James Wilson, forever 21. The sight made her pause, the reality of sacrifice hitting home in a new and personal way. "Those memorials," Commander Torres said, noting her attention to the sticker, "they're not just about remembering the past. They're reminders that service and sacrifice are ongoing. Every day, men and women in uniform put their lives on the line. Every day, families wait and worry. These parking spaces, they're small acknowledgements of that continuous sacrifice." The mother of the deployed soldier stepped forward again. "When I see someone respect these spaces," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "it tells me they understand what our families go through. It tells me they remember that freedom isn't just a word. It's paid for in blood and tears." Andrea's hands trembled slightly as she unlocked her car. The leather seats and luxury interior that had once felt like symbols of her success now seemed to mock her previous values. The morning sun reflected off the hood, momentarily blinding her, a flash of light that felt almost symbolic of her, awakening understanding. "Before you move," Torres said, his voice carrying that quiet authority that had first caught her attention, "I want you to understand something. This moment, it's not about shame or guilt. It's about growth, about choosing to be better once you know better." A young couple walked past, slowing as they noticed the gathering. The man wore a Marine Corps t-shirt, and his partner carried a small child. They joined the circle of observers, the Marine's expression showing immediate understanding of what was unfolding. "When we train new SEALs," Torres continued, "we teach them that mistakes are inevitable. What matters is how you respond to them. Do you deny them, try to justify them, or do you acknowledge them and use them as opportunities for growth?" Andrea started her car, the quiet purr of the engine seeming somehow inappropriate for the gravity of the moment. Through her windshield, she could see her reflection in the cafe windows, a woman she barely recognized anymore, someone in the process of fundamental change. The young Marine who had just joined the crowd spoke up. "Ma'am," he said, bouncing, his child gently in his arms, "what you're doing right now, this is what respect looks like, not just moving your car, but understanding why it matters." As Andrea carefully backed out of the veteran's space, she noticed more details she'd missed before. The fresh flowers someone had placed by the veteran's memorial near the cafe entrance, the way the morning light caught the service flags, flying alongside the American flag, the respectful distance other cars had left around the designated spaces. "Every choice we make," Torres said, as she maneuvered her vehicle toward a regular parking spot several rows back, "tells a story about who we are and what we value. The question is, what story do we want to tell? Tell us in the comments if you've ever witnessed someone transform their mistake into a moment of growth. Tomorrow's part will reveal how this simple act of moving a car becomes the catalyst for much bigger changes in Andrea's life. After parking her Range Rover in a regular spot several rows back, Andrea took a moment to collect herself before stepping out. The walk back to the group felt longer than just a few rows of parking spaces. It felt like crossing a divide between who she had been and who she was becoming. Commander Torres watched her approach, noting the change in her bearing. Gone was the defensive pride, replaced by something more genuine, more grounded. The morning sun caught the moisture in her eyes as she rejoined the group, but these weren't tears of frustration or embarrassment. They were tears of understanding. "You know what we teach our teams about transformation?" Torres said, his voice carrying across the now quiet parking lot. "We tell them that real change isn't about a single moment of revelation. It's about what you do with that revelation, how you let it reshape your understanding of the world." The Vietnam veteran who had spoken earlier nodded in agreement. "It's like when we came home," he said. "Some of us took years to understand that our experiences hadn't just changed what we did, they'd changed who we were. Sometimes it takes a moment like this to see yourself clearly." Andrea thought about her father again, about all the subtle lessons he'd tried to teach her. "I remember," she began, her voice stronger now, "how my father would always insist on holding doors for people in uniform. I used to think it was just old-fashioned courtesy, but it was more than that, wasn't it?" "Your father understood something fundamental," Torres replied. "Every small gesture of respect, every moment of acknowledgement, they're not just about the individual. They're about recognizing the larger sacrifice, the deeper commitment that uniform represents." The mother of the deployed soldier stepped forward again, touching Andrea's arm gently. "When my son left for his deployment, she said, he told me something I'll never forget. He said that service isn't about the big moments. It's about the small choices we make every day to put others first." A cool breeze swept through the parking lot, carrying the sound of flags snapping in the wind. Andrea noticed how every service member present instinctively turned toward the sound, their ingrained respect, a testament to the values she was just beginning to understand. "In the teams," Torres continued, "we have a saying, yesterday's ego is today's obstacle. It means that sometimes our biggest challenge isn't the situation we're facing, it's our own reluctance to admit we need to change." The young Marine who had joined them with his family spoke up again. "Ma'am," he said, still cradling his child, "what you did just now, moving your car, that wasn't just about following rules, it was about choosing to be part of something bigger than yourself." Andrea looked at the veteran's parking space she had vacated, now empty, and waiting for someone who had earned the right to use it. The sign seemed different now, not an inconvenience to be ignored, but a symbol of sacrifice and service that deserved respect. "Commander," she said, turning back to Torres, "I keep thinking about what you said earlier, about how character shows itself in the small choices we make when we think no one's watching. I've been so focused on being seen, on projecting success, that I forgot to pay attention to who I was becoming." The crowd had grown quieter, sensing the authenticity of her words. Through the cafe windows, Andrea could see her team watching, their expressions a mix of surprise and respect at this unexpected transformation of their usually unyielding leader. "In combat," Torres replied, "you learn quickly that reputation and reality need to align. It's not about what others think of you, it's about knowing who you are when everything else is stripped away." The morning had grown warmer, but Andrea felt a different kind of warmth spreading through her chest. The warmth of genuine understanding, of reconnecting with values her father had tried to instill in her long ago. Tell us in the comments if you've ever experienced a moment that made you completely rethink who you are and what you stand for. Tomorrow's part will show how this transformation affects not just Andrea, but everyone who witnessed it. The morning had stretched into midday, the California sun now high overhead, casting shorter shadows across the parking lot. The crowd that had gathered to witness Andrea's transformation remained, their presence a testament to the power of the moment they had shared. "You know what we tell our new operators?" Commander Torres said, his voice carrying a note of thoughtful reflection. "We tell them that true leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to grow, to learn from our mistakes, and to show others the way forward through our own example." A young woman stepped forward from the crowd, tears visible in her eyes. "I need to confess something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've parked in veteran spaces before, using the same excuses about being in a hurry. Watching this." She gestured to Andrea and the now vacant parking space. "It's made me realize how wrong I was." Andrea felt a surge of emotion, not shame this time, but a strange sort of pride in knowing that her moment of transformation was already touching others. The Vietnam veteran who had spoken earlier placed a weathered hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Recognition is the first step," he said kindly. "That's how change spreads. One person's awakening becomes another person's lesson." Through the cafe windows, Andrea could see her team members beginning to return, their expressions showing a new kind of respect. Not the fear-based deference they had shown before, but something more genuine. One by one, they began to exit the cafe, joining the gathering in the parking lot. "Ma'am," her senior agent said, addressing her with newfound sincerity, "we've been thinking maybe we should start including veteran housing assistance in our real estate programs. There are a lot of service members in San Diego who could use help finding affordable homes." Commander Torres nodded approvingly. "That's how real change works," he said. "It starts with a moment of understanding, but it grows into action that can make a real difference in people's lives." The mother of the deployed soldier wiped fresh tears from her eyes. "When my son comes home," she said, "he won't just see that veteran parking space. He'll know that his service inspired people to think differently, to act differently, to be better." Andrea thought about her father again, about how he would have reacted to this moment. She could almost see his proud smile, could almost hear his quiet voice saying, "Now you understand, sweetheart." "Commander," she said, turning to Torres, "I want to do more than just move my car. I want to make this mean something." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "My company, my influence in the community. Maybe they can serve a bigger purpose than just making money." The young Marine with his family stepped forward again. "That's what service is really about," he said, bouncing his child gently. "It's not just about what you give up, it's about what you give back." A gentle breeze carried the sound of the American flag, snapping in the wind, and once again, every service member present stood a little straighter. Andrea found herself standing straighter too, feeling a new kind of pride, not in her personal achievements, but in being part of something larger than herself. "In the teams," Torres said, his eyes scanning the gathered crowd, "we learn that every mission has ripple effects that go far beyond the immediate objective. Sometimes a single moment, a single choice, can create waves of change that touch countless lives." The cafe owner had joined them now, listening intently. "Starting today," he announced, "we're offering free coffee to all veterans and active duty military. It's not much, but it's a start." Andrea watched as others in the crowd began to nod, to speak up with their own ideas, for showing respect and support. Her transformation was becoming a catalyst for community change, turning a simple parking space dispute into something much more meaningful. "You know what the hardest part of training is?" Torres asked, his voice carrying across the now bustling crowd. "It's not the physical challenges or the technical skills. It's learning to see beyond yourself, to understand that your actions affect others in ways you might never know." Tell us in the comments if you've ever witnessed a single moment of change create a ripple effect through an entire community. Tomorrow's part will show the lasting impact of this transformation on Andrea, Commander Torres, and everyone who witnessed this powerful moment. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Sunrise Coffee House as Andrea stood with Commander Torres and the gathered crowd. What had begun as a simple parking dispute had transformed into something far more significant, a moment of community awakening and personal transformation. "Before we all go our separate ways," Commander Torres said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "I want to share something we teach our new SEALs. We tell them that the most important victory isn't winning the battle. It's understanding why you fought it in the first place." Andrea looked at her Range Rover, now properly parked several rows back. The distance seemed symbolic of how far she had come in just a few hours. Her phone had long since stopped buzzing with messages about missed meetings and rescheduled appointments, as if the universe itself was acknowledging that some things were more important than business. "Commander," she said, her voice steady, with newfound purpose, "I want you to know that this isn't just a moment for me. It's a beginning." She turned to address the crowd that had witnessed her transformation. "My company has resources, influence in the community. Starting today, we're going to use that influence for something more than just profit." The Vietnam veteran who had shared his wisdom throughout the morning nodded approvingly. "That's how real change happens," he said. "It starts with a moment of understanding, but it grows into action that can make a real difference." The mother of the deployed soldier stepped forward again, this time holding her phone. "I just texted my son about what happened here," she said, her eyes bright with tears. "He says this is why he serves, not for recognition, but for moments like this, when people choose to be better." Through the cafe windows, Andrea could see her team gathering their things, preparing to leave. But they were different now too. She could see it in their posture, in the way they looked at her with new respect, not born of fear, but of genuine admiration for her willingness to change. "In the teams," Torres said, observing the scene, "we have a saying, the mission isn't over until the lessons are learned. Today, those lessons seem to be reaching far beyond this parking lot." The cafe owner approached with a tray of fresh coffee for everyone. "You know," he said, setting the tray down on a nearby table, "I've been thinking. We're going to redesign our whole parking lot, more spaces for veterans, better accessibility, maybe even a small memorial garden." Andrea felt something shift inside her, a final piece falling into place. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her father's old dog tags, which she'd carried for years without really understanding why. Looking at them now, she saw them not as relics of the past, but as symbols of the values she was finally beginning to understand. "My father would have been proud of this moment," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet lot. "Not because I admitted a mistake, but because I finally understood what he tried to teach me about service, about putting others first." Commander Torres smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "Your father's lessons found their mark," he said. "Sometimes it takes a moment like this to shake us awake, to help us see what's been in front of us all along." The young Marine who had joined them earlier shifted his sleeping child in his arms. "This is what we hope for," he said softly. "Not recognition or special treatment, but understanding, real understanding." As the group began to naturally disperse, each person carrying away their own lessons from the morning's events, Andrea turned one last time to Commander Torres. "Thank you," she said simply, "not for correcting me, but for taking the time to help me understand." "Understanding is the greatest victory," he replied. "And judging by what I've seen here today, that victory will keep spreading long after we've all gone home." The afternoon breeze carried the sound of the flag snapping one last time, and every service member present stood at attention. This time, Andrea stood straight too, finally understanding that she wasn't just showing respect, she was becoming part of something larger than herself. As she watched Commander Torres walk away, his bearing as straight and proud as when he first approached her car hours ago, Andrea knew that her life had changed forever. The parking space that had started it all remained empty, waiting for someone who had earned the right to use it, a small symbol of respect that now carried profound meaning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.